A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Snow and Silence. The mountains of the northern reach knew no mercy in winter. Elspeth had learned this truth during her first season alone in the stone cabin that clung to the mountainside, and she had carried it with her through 3 winters since. Tonight, the wind howled through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading, and the snow fell in sheets so thick that she could barely see the woodpile 10 paces from her door. She stood at the window, her breath fogging the warped glass, watching the storm devour the world beyond. At 24, Elspeth had grown accustomed to solitude. The pack Gräfin had cast her out 2 years past, their alpha's judgment swift and merciless. "Sterile Omega," he had declared before the assembled pack, his lip curling with disgust. "You are a burden we can no longer afford to carry." The memory still stung, though she had learned to live with the ache of it. She touched the simple wooden pendant at her throat, the only possession she had brought from her old life, a gift from her mother before sickness had claimed her. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by some long-dead hermit who had understood the necessity of thick walls and a solid roof. Elspeth had made it hers through 2 years of work, her hands growing calloused as she learned to chop wood, to repair the roof, to recognize which mountain herbs could be sold in the valley below for coin. The howling wind shifted, and beneath it, Elspeth heard something else, a sound so faint that at first she thought she had imagined it. She pressed her ear to the cold glass, her breath stilling in her lungs. There it was again. A cry, thin and desperate, nearly swallowed by the storm. An animal, perhaps. A fox kit separated from its mother, or a young wolf lost in the blizzard. Elspeth knew she should ignore it. The storm was too fierce, the darkness too complete. To venture out now would be madness. But the cry came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. That was no animal. That was a human child. Elspeth's heart lurched. She grabbed her heaviest cloak from the peg by the door, wrapping it tight around her shoulders, and thrust her feet into her worn boots. The wind nearly tore the door from her hands when she opened it, driving snow into her face with stinging force. She pulled her hood low and stepped into the storm. The cold bit through her cloak immediately, finding every gap in the fabric. Elspeth moved forward, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall of the cabin to keep her bearings. The cry came again, slightly to her left, deeper into the tree line. She pushed toward it, her boots sinking into snow that reached past her knees. The forest closed around her, the pine trees providing some shelter from the worst of the wind. Elspeth's eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and the snow itself provided a dim illumination. She could see perhaps 20 paces ahead. No more. The crying grew louder, not the wail of distress she had expected, but a rhythmic, exhausted sobbing that spoke of a child who had been crying for a very long time. Elspeth quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found the basket beneath an ancient oak, its branches heavy with snow. The basket itself was half buried, but she could see the edge of fine woven wicker and the corner of what looked to be a costly blanket. Elspeth dropped to her knees beside it, her fingers numb as she brushed away the snow. Inside, wrapped in blankets of deep crimson wool trimmed with silver thread, was an infant. 6 months old, perhaps, with a round face reddened by cold and eyes squeezed shut as it cried. Elspeth's hands moved without thought, lifting the child from the basket and drawing it against her chest, tucking it inside her cloak where her body's warmth might reach it. "Hush now," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. "I have you. You're safe." The moment the child's skin touched hers, pain exploded across Elspeth's right wrist. She gasped, nearly dropping the infant, as heat like liquid fire spread from her pulse point up her forearm. She looked down and saw, to her shock, a mark appearing on her skin. It glowed with an inner light, silver white against her pale flesh, forming the shape of a crescent moon crossed by a sword. The royal mark. Elspeth knew it from stories told around pack Gräfin's fires, tales of the Alpha King and his ancient bloodline. But such marks were not given lightly. They were bonds of protection, of destiny, appearing only when ordained by the moon goddess herself. The pain faded to a steady burn, and Elspeth became aware that the child had stopped crying. She looked down to find a pair of light blue eyes staring up at her, with an intensity that seemed impossible for one so young. The infant's tiny hand had curled around Elspeth's finger, holding tight. Movement in the corner of her vision made Elspeth turn. A few paces away, half hidden in the snow, was the body of a man. She recognized the royal livery immediately, the crimson and silver that marked him as one of the Alpha King's personal guard. He lay on his side, his hand still reaching toward the basket, as though his final act had been to push it deeper into the shelter of the oak's roots. Elspeth shifted the child to one arm and crawled closer to the fallen guard. His face was turned toward her, and even in death she could read the determination in his features. He had been a large man, broad-shouldered and strong, with a blonde beard and hair that was now matted with blood and ice. His armor bore the marks of savage combat. Deep gouges scored the metal, gouges that could only have been made by claws. Wolf claws, but larger than any natural beast. A shifter had killed him. Multiple shifters, judging by the number of wounds. Elspeth's hands trembled as she searched the body. Protocol demanded she show respect, but necessity demanded answers. In the inner pocket of his cloak, she found a leather pouch. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, the edges stained with blood that had frozen in dark streaks. She couldn't read it here, not in the storm. The child in her arms began to whimper again, and Elspeth made her decision. She would take both the infant and the guard's body back to her cabin. The dead deserved dignity, and she could not leave him to be buried by snow and forgotten. It took 3 trips. First the child, settled into a basket by her fire. Then the guard's body, which she dragged with great difficulty through the snow. Finally she returned for the basket and its costly blankets, and for the guard's weapons and armor. By the time she had everything inside her cabin, Elspeth was shaking with exhaustion and cold. She built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, then turned her attention to the child. The infant was a girl, she discovered, and appeared healthy despite her ordeal. Elspeth heated water and used a soft cloth to clean the baby's face and hands, checking for injury. It was then that she noticed the medallion around the child's neck. It was small, clearly made to be worn by an infant, hanging from a delicate silver chain. The disc was engraved with a name, Rosalind, and beneath it, the seal of the Alpha King, the same crescent moon and sword that now marked Elspeth's wrist. This was not just any noble's child. This was the Alpha King's daughter, the heir to the throne. Elspeth sank into her chair, the weight of understanding settling over her shoulders. The mark on her wrist pulsed in time with her heartbeat, warm against her skin. She had heard tales of such marks, though she had never believed them to be more than legend. They appeared, it was said, when the moon goddess herself intervened in mortal affairs, when a protector was chosen for one of royal blood. But why her? Elspeth was nothing. A rejected Omega with no pack, no family, no power. She couldn't even shift, her wolf silent within her since the day of her birth, another reason for Pat Graffin's contempt. The baby, Rosalind, began to fuss again. Elspeth lifted her carefully, rocking her with an awkwardness born of inexperience. She had never cared for an infant before, but as she held the child against her shoulder, Rosalind's cries quieted. The baby's breathing evened out, and within moments she had fallen asleep, her small body relaxing completely. The mark on Elspeth's wrist flared warm, almost pleased. When Rosalind was settled in the basket lined with the royal blankets, Elspeth finally allowed herself to examine the letter she had taken from the dead guard. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the frozen creases. The hand that had written it had been hurried, the ink smudged in places. "Percival," it began. "By order of the Alpha King, you are to take the princess to the western watchtower and remain there until dawn. Trust no one from the inner court. There is a traitor among us, identity unknown. Protect the heir with your life. Cillian." The letter was unsigned beyond the king's name, but the wax seal at the bottom was genuine. Elspeth had seen enough royal documents in her life to recognize authenticity. Percival had failed in his mission, but not through any fault of his own. The wounds on his body told the story. He had been ambushed, overwhelmed by numbers. He had done the only thing he could, hidden the princess, and died defending her hiding place. and somehow, through fate or divine intervention, Elspeth had found her. She looked down at the mark on her wrist, watching it pulse with that strange silver light. The pain had faded to a dull ache, but she could feel something else now. A connection. Tenuous but real, linking her to the sleeping child. When she tried to move more than a few paces away from the basket, the mark flared hot in warning, and Rosalind immediately began to whimper. Elspeth returned to her side, and the child settled once more. "What have you done to me, little one?" Elspeth whispered. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, an Omega who had been cast aside by her pack stood watch over an infant princess, and on her wrist, a mark that should not exist, pulsed with the light of destiny. Chapter 2. The mark burns dawn, came slowly to the mountains, the sky lightening from black to gray, while snow continued to fall in lazy spirals. Elspeth had not slept. She had spent the night sitting beside the basket where Princess Rosalind slumbered, watching the rise and fall of the infant's chest, and wondering what madness had brought her to this moment. The mark on her wrist had not faded with the coming of morning. If anything, it seemed brighter now, the silver line standing out sharply against her pale skin. She had tried once to move to the far corner of the cabin to retrieve more firewood. The mark had flared with immediate heat, and Rosalind had woken with a cry of distress that stopped only when Elspeth returned to her side. They were bound. Somehow, impossibly, an Omega who could not shift had been marked by the moon goddess herself as protector to the Alpha King's heir. Elspeth was stirring porridge over the fire when she heard the sounds outside. Horses, several of them, their hooves crunching through snow. Men's voices calling to one another. She set down her spoon and moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. Through the warped glass, she could see them. A dozen soldiers in royal livery, their armor catching the weak morning light. They were spread out in a line, moving methodically through the forest, searching. One of them pointed toward her cabin, and the group began to converge on her door. Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they arrived. Her eyes darted around the small space, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to hide an infant. The cabin had been built by a hermit, she reminded herself. A man who had valued his privacy, who might have had reason to hide things. She dropped to her knees beside the hearth, running her hands along the stone floor. There, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, was a seam in the stones. Elspeth's fingers found the hidden catch, and a section of the floor lifted away, revealing a space perhaps 2 feet deep. It was meant for storing valuables, or perhaps contraband. Now it would hide a princess. Elspeth lifted Rosalind from the basket, wrapping her tightly in the warmest blanket. "Be silent, little one," she whispered. "Please, for both our sakes, be silent." She lowered the baby into the hidden compartment, her hands shaking. The moment Rosalind left her arms, the mark on her wrist began to burn. Not the sharp flare of warning from before, but a steady, insistent heat. Elspeth gritted her teeth against the pain and replaced the stone, covering the seam with a worn rug. The pounding on her door came seconds later. "Open! In the name of the Alpha King!" Elspeth took a breath to steady herself, then crossed to the door and lifted the latch. 3 soldiers stood on her threshold, their hands on their sword hilts. Behind them, she could see the others fanning out to search the surrounding area. "Yes?" Elspeth kept her voice level, though her wrist felt as though it were being held over an open flame. The lead soldier was young, perhaps 25, with a scar across his jaw and eyes that missed nothing. "We are searching for a missing child, an infant of 6 months, taken during the night. Have you seen or heard anything unusual?" "I heard the storm," Elspeth replied. "Nothing more. I live alone here. I see few travelers, especially in winter." The soldier's gaze swept past her, taking in the small cabin. "We must search your home. King's orders." Elspeth stepped aside, forcing herself to remain calm even as the mark burned hotter. Of course, the soldiers entered, their boots tracking snow across her clean floor. They were thorough, she had to give them that. They opened every cupboard, looked into every corner, even climbed the ladder to examine the small loft where she slept. One of them paused by the basket near the fire, the basket where Rosalind had been sleeping only minutes before. "What's this?" he asked, nudging it with his boot. "A basket," Elspeth said. The mark flared, and she could hear, very faintly, a whimper from beneath the stones. "I use it for gathering herbs." The soldier with the scar moved closer to the hearth. He was standing directly over the hidden compartment now, and the mark on Elspeth's wrist blazed with warning. Her vision swam with the pain, but she kept her face impassive. Another whimper, slightly louder. The soldier's head tilted, listening. "Did you hear that?" he asked his companions. Elspeth's mind raced. "The wind," she said quickly. "It makes strange sounds in the chimney when it blows from the north." The soldier frowned, but before he could investigate further, one of his companions called from outside. "Nothing here. No tracks. No signs of passage." The scarred soldier gave the cabin one last searching look, then nodded to his men. "We move on. There are other cabins to search before nightfall." They filed out, and Elspeth stood at the door, watching them mount their horses and ride away into the forest. Only when they had disappeared from view did she allow herself to breathe. She dropped to her knees beside the hearth, pulling up the stone with shaking hands. Rosalind looked up at her, blue eyes wide, and the mark on Elspeth's wrist immediately cooled to its normal warmth. The pain vanished as though it had never been. "Clever girl," Elspeth whispered, lifting the child into her arms. "You knew to be silent." But even as relief flooded through her, Elspeth understood the truth of her situation. The soldiers would not stop searching. Sooner or later they would return, perhaps with mages who could sense the royal blood in Rosalind's veins. And there was the matter of the mark itself. Elspeth pulled back her sleeve, staring at the silver crescent and sword that now decorated her skin. This mark made her a target. Anyone who saw it would know what it meant. They would know she had been chosen to protect the princess. The thought crystallized into certainty. She could not stay here. She had to take Rosalind back to the Alpha King herself. The mark would allow no other course. She had tested its limits and found them absolute. She could not be more than 50 paces from the child without pain that would soon become unbearable. Elspeth spent the next hour preparing for a journey she had never wanted to make. She packed dried meat, hard bread, a water skin. She wrapped Rosalind in layers of wool and placed her in a sling that would keep the baby close to her body. She strapped a knife to her belt and pulled on her warmest cloak. Percival's body she could not take with her. But she wrapped him in his own cloak and said a prayer to the moon goddess for his spirit. He had died, protecting a child. There was honor in that. The descent from the mountain took most of the morning. Elspeth moved carefully, testing each step before putting her weight on it. The snow was deep in places, and the path treacherous. Rosalind remained quiet against her chest, apparently content as long as they stayed close together. By midday, Elspeth had reached the forest proper. Here the trees grew thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the falling snow. The going was easier, and she picked up her pace, following a deer trail that wound roughly southward toward the distant capital. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when her wolf senses, dormant for so long she had forgotten she possessed them, suddenly flared to life. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She was being watched. Elspeth turned slowly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. At first she saw nothing but trees and snow, then movement, a flash of gray fur between the trunks. They stepped out of the shadows, 5 of them, wolves far larger than any natural beast, shifters then, in their animal forms. Renegades, judging by the way they moved, without the discipline of pack hunters, their lips pulled back from their teeth, revealing fangs the length of Elspeth's fingers. "I have no quarrel with you," Elspeth said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. She shifted her stance, placing her body between the wolves and the child at her chest. "Let me pass." The largest of the wolves, a male with a torn ear, took a step closer. He was scenting the air, his nostrils flaring, his eyes fixed on her wrist, where the mark was barely visible beneath her sleeve. A growl rumbled from his chest, and the other wolves began to circle. Elspeth turned with them, keeping them in her sight. Her hand tightened on her knife, though she knew it would do little good against 5 shifters. The torn-eared wolf lunged. Something inside Elspeth broke open. Not broke, she realized distantly. Awakened. Her wolf, silent since birth, rose within her with a roar that existed only in her mind. Power flooded through her veins, hot and wild and utterly unfamiliar. Her right hand, the one holding the knife, began to change. Her fingers lengthened, the nails extending into curved claws that gleamed like polished gold. Her eyes burned, and she knew without seeing that they had changed color, shifting from their normal honey brown to a molten amber that seemed to glow from within. The partial transformation should have been impossible. Elspeth had never shifted, not even as much as a finger. But the power was there now, undeniable, surging through her in waves that left her gasping. She slashed with her clawed hand, and the torn-eared wolf jerked back, a line of blood appearing across his muzzle. The others stopped circling. They were staring at her now, not with hunger, but with something that looked like fear. Silver. One of them whispered, the word emerging as a half-human growl. A name spat like a curse. They scattered, disappearing into the forest so quickly that Elspeth barely saw them go. She stood alone on the trail, her hand still transformed, her heart pounding. Slowly, shakily, she watched as the claws retracted, as her fingers returned to their normal shape. The glow faded from her eyes. Rosalind stirred against her chest, making a small sound of complaint. Elspeth looked down at the baby, then at her own hand. Now perfectly ordinary again, visible anymore. Chapter 3. The King's Judgment. The fortress of the Alpha King rose from the river valley like a crown of stone and iron. Elspeth stood at the edge of the forest, staring up at walls that seemed to scrape the belly of the gray sky. Banners snapped in the wind, crimson and silver catching what little light filtered through the clouds. She had never seen anything so vast, so imposing. The Pack-Grafen's longhouse could have fit 10 times over within those walls and still left room. Rosalind stirred against her chest, making soft noises of complaint. The baby had been remarkably patient during their journey, but now hunger and discomfort were making themselves known. Elspeth adjusted the sling, whispering wordless comfort, and began the final descent toward the main gate. The guards saw her coming long before she reached them. 6 men in full armor stood at attention before the iron portcullis, their hands on their weapons. As Elspeth approached, 2 of them moved forward to intercept her. "State your business," the taller one demanded. He was perhaps 30, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw. Elspeth had rehearsed this moment a dozen times during her walk. "I carry a message for the Alpha King, one that concerns the safety of his daughter." The guards exchanged glances. The scarred one's nostrils flared as he caught Rosalind's scent, and his expression shifted from suspicion to alarm. "Where did you get that child?" His hand moved to his sword hilt. "I found her," Elspeth said steadily. "In the mountains, 2 nights past, with a dead guard named Percival beside her. She wore the royal seal." She shifted her cloak, revealing the medallion still hanging around Rosalind's neck. "And when I touched her, this appeared." She held out her right wrist, letting the mark catch the light. The silver crescent and sword gleamed against her skin, pulsing faintly with its own inner glow. Both guards stepped back, their faces going pale. The scarred one made a sign against evil with his left hand. "Moon's mercy," the other guard breathed. "That's the protection mark, the one the king put on the princess before she was taken. Fetch Captain Harwin," the scarred guard ordered. "Now. And send word to the king that his daughter has been found." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Elspeth was escorted through the gates, across a vast courtyard where soldiers drilled and servants hurried about their tasks. Every eye turned to watch her pass, whispers following in her wake. The baby wrapped against her chest drew as much attention as the mark on her wrist. They brought her to a side chamber to wait while messengers ran to alert the court. A maid brought water and bread, though Elspeth found she had no appetite. Her stomach was knotted with anxiety, and the mark on her wrist had begun to pulse faster, as though responding to the proximity of something, or someone. When the door finally opened, it was not a servant who entered, but a delegation. At its head was a man who could only be the Alpha King himself. Cillian was tall, easily a head above the guards who flanked him, with shoulders broad enough to block out the torchlight. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling past his collar, and his beard was trimmed close to his jaw, but it was his eyes that held Elspeth frozen in place. They were the color of ice over deep water, gray-blue and utterly merciless, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her wolf, newly awakened, cringe inside her chest. Behind him came a woman in robes of white and gray, a priestess by the look of her, and an older man with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes who wore the chain of office that marked him as a high counselor. "You claim to have found my daughter," Cillian said without preamble. His voice was deep, controlled, but Elspeth could hear the rage simmering beneath it. "I did, Your Majesty." Elspeth forced herself to meet his gaze. 2 nights ago, during the storm, she was abandoned in a basket beneath an oak tree. Your guard Percival was dead nearby, killed by shifter claws. He died protecting her. She produced the blood-stained letter from her cloak and held it out. Cillian took it, his jaw tightening as he read. "This is my hand," he confirmed. "I sent Percival to take Rosalind to the western watchtower. We had intelligence of a threat, but the source was unclear." He looked up. "How did you come by the royal mark?" "I don't know," Elspeth admitted. "The moment I lifted her from the basket, it appeared, burned itself into my skin. Since then, I cannot be parted from her. If I move more than 50 paces away, the mark causes pain, and the princess cries until I return." The counselor leaned forward. "A convenient story. How do we know you are not the very threat we feared? That you did not kill Percival yourself and take the child?" Elspeth's hands tightened on Rosalind. "If I meant her harm, why would I bring her here? Why not disappear into the wilderness? To gain access to the castle," the counselor countered. "To infiltrate the court and strike from within." "Enough, Osmond." Cillian raised a hand. He stepped closer to Elspeth, so close she could smell leather and pine and something wild beneath. "Give her to me." It was not a request. Elspeth's heart hammered as she looked down at Rosalind, sleeping peacefully in the sling. Every instinct screamed at her not to let go, but this was the child's father. Surely the mark would understand that. Slowly, carefully, she began to unwrap the sling. The moment the fabric loosened, Rosalind's eyes flew open. The baby looked up at Cillian's face and began to wail, a sound of pure distress that echoed off the stone walls. Cillian reached for his daughter, and Rosalind's cries intensified. She twisted away from her father's hands, arching her back, her face going red with the force of her screaming. The mark on Elspeth's wrist flared hot, not quite painful, but impossible to ignore. She pulled Rosalind back against her chest, and the baby immediately quieted, her cries fading to hiccuping sobs. The silence that followed was deafening. The priestess moved forward, her lined face grave. "May I examine the mark, child?" Elspeth nodded, holding out her wrist. The old woman's fingers were cool as they traced the silver lines, her eyes closing in concentration. After a long moment, she stepped back and turned to face the king. "It is genuine, Your Majesty. A protection mark, placed by the moon goddess herself. Only one chosen as the child's true guardian could receive such a mark." She paused. "Only one destined to stand as Luna could bear it without being consumed." The word fell into the chamber with the weight of a stone. "Luna, mate to the Alpha King, mother to his children, ruler of the realm." "That's impossible," Osmond said flatly. "She's a nobody, a rogue Omega without pack or family. The king cannot be bound to such a creature by mere accident." "The moon goddess does not deal in accidents," the priestess replied sharply. "What she wills with purpose." Cillian had not moved. He stood staring at Elspeth as though seeing her for the first time, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What is your name?" "Elspeth, Your Majesty. Formerly of Pack Grafen." "Formerly?" "I was cast out 2 years ago. They said I was sterile, a burden on the Pack's resources." Something flickered in Cillian's eyes. "And yet the moon goddess has chosen you to protect my daughter. To stand, perhaps, as Luna to this realm." He shook his head slowly. "The ways of the divine are strange indeed." He turned to Osmond. She will remain in the castle under my protection. No one is to harm her or question her without my permission. Is that understood? Your Majesty, Osmond began. But Cillian cut him off with a look. I said, is that understood? Yes, Your Majesty. Cillian looked back at Elspeth. You will be given rooms in the East Wing, adjacent to the royal apartments. My daughter appears to require your presence, and I would have her close. We will speak again tomorrow, when you have had time to rest. He started to leave, then paused at the door. And Elspeth? Thank you for bringing her home. Then he was gone, taking Osmond and half the guards with him. The priestess remained, studying Elspeth with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to bone. You have been given a great burden, child, she said quietly, and a great gift. The mark will protect you, but it will also bind you. You cannot leave the princess, not without great pain, and she, in turn, will not accept comfort from another while you live. I understand, Elspeth said, though in truth she understood very little. Do you? The priestess smiled faintly. You have become essential to the future of this realm, whether you willed it or not. There are those who will resent that, those who will see you as a threat. Be careful, Elspeth of No Pack. The castle has many eyes, and not all of them are kind. She left then, her robes whispering against the stone floor. A servant appeared to lead Elspeth to her new quarters, through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, up staircases worn smooth by centuries of feet. The rooms they gave her were beyond anything she had imagined. A sitting room with a fireplace large enough to stand in, a bedchamber with a mattress so soft it seemed to swallow her, and a small adjoining room clearly meant as a nursery. Rosalind was provided with a cradle of carved oak, lined with blankets of the softest wool. But when Elspeth tried to lay the baby in it, Rosalind immediately began to fuss. Only when Elspeth pulled the cradle beside the bed, within arm's reach, did the princess settle. A knock at the door brought a maid with food, hot stew, and fresh bread and cheese that made Elspeth's mouth water. She ate mechanically, her mind elsewhere, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 2 days. She was in the Alpha King's castle. She wore a mark that declared her the moon goddess's choice to protect, and perhaps to mate with, the most powerful shifter in the realm. And she had no idea why. Outside her window, night was falling. Torches were being lit along the battlements, their flames dancing in the wind. Somewhere in this vast fortress, Cillian was dealing with the political nightmare her arrival had created. Somewhere, Osmond was plotting. She was certain of it. The counselor's eyes had held too much calculation, too little surprise. And somewhere, out in the darkness beyond the walls, whoever had tried to kill Rosalind was still free. Chapter 4. Shadows and Secrets. Elspeth woke to gray dawn light, filtering through curtains she had not closed. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was. Then Rosalind made a soft cooing sound from the cradle beside the bed, and memory crashed back. The castle. The Alpha King. The impossible mark burning on her wrist. She sat up, every muscle protesting. She had slept in her clothes, too exhausted to do more than collapse onto the mattress after the maid had left. Rosalind was awake, her blue eyes tracking the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, perfectly content. A knock at the door made Elspeth jump. "Enter," she called, her voice rough with sleep. A different maid appeared, younger than the one from the night before, with brown hair braided in a crown around her head. "Begging your pardon, miss, but the king requests your presence at breakfast. In 1 hour. I'm to help you dress." Elspeth looked down at her travel-stained clothing and suppressed a laugh. "I have nothing to wear but what I'm wearing." The king thought as much. He sent these. The maid gestured, and 2 more servants entered carrying an armload of garments. Dresses of wool and linen, shifts and stockings, even a pair of soft leather boots. "They were the late queen's, miss. The king said you looked to be of a size." The late queen, Cillian's mate, dead childbirth. Elspeth had heard the story even in the mountains. The entire realm had mourned. "That's very generous," Elspeth managed. She lifted Rosalind from the cradle, and the baby immediately grabbed a fistful of her hair. "But I can't leave the princess. The mark won't allow it." "The king knows, miss. You're to bring her." An hour later, Elspeth found herself walking through corridors that seemed even more vast in daylight, following a guard whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. She wore a dress of deep green wool that fit reasonably well, though it was loose in the shoulders. Her hair, washed and braided by the efficient maid, hung down her back in a thick plait. Rosalind rode against her chest in a new sling of soft leather, wide awake and curious about her surroundings. The breakfast chamber was smaller than she had expected, a room with windows overlooking the river, and a table that could seat perhaps a dozen. Cillian was already there, along with Osmond and 3 other men Elspeth did not recognize. They all rose when she entered, a courtesy that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Elspeth," Cillian gestured to a chair at his right hand. "Please sit. You must be hungry." She was, desperately, but the sight of so much food made her stomach clench with nerves. Bread and cheese, cold meat and fruit, porridge sweetened with honey. She settled into the indicated chair, acutely aware of every eye on her. "These are members of my inner council," Cillian continued, nodding to the other men. "Lord Brennan, who commands my armies, Sir Hugh, my master of coin, and Father Aldrich, who serves as both priest and healer. You've met Osmond, my chief advisor." Elspeth nodded to each in turn. Lord Brennan was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and a soldier's bearing. Sir Hugh was younger, thin, and nervous-looking. Father Aldrich had kind eyes and weathered hands. "I've asked you here to discuss what happened," Cillian said, "and what must happen next. The attack on my daughter was clearly orchestrated by someone with knowledge of the castle and its routines, someone who knew when and how Percival would be moving her." "A traitor," Lord Brennan said bluntly, "in your own household." "So it would seem." Cillian's jaw tightened. "We've been questioning everyone who had access to that information. So far, we've found nothing." Osmond leaned forward. "With respect, Your Majesty, we should also be investigating how this woman came to receive the royal mark. It's unprecedented. Some would say impossible. And yet it happened." Cillian's voice held a warning edge. The priestess confirmed its authenticity. "Unless you're questioning the moon goddess herself." "Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely suggest caution. We know nothing about this woman. Her past, her loyalties, her intentions. My intentions are to keep the princess alive," Elspeth said, speaking for the first time. "That's all the mark allows me to do. I couldn't leave her if I wanted to." Osmond's eyes narrowed. "Convenient, is it?" Elspeth met his gaze steadily. "I've lost my home, my freedom, and any hope of a normal life. The mark has bound me to a child I didn't ask for, and a destiny I never wanted. If this is convenience, I'd hate to see what you consider a burden." Silence fell around the table. Then, unexpectedly, Lord Brennan laughed. "She has spirit, Your Majesty. I'll give her that." Cillian's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been approval. "Elspeth will remain under my protection. No one is to question that. Our focus must be on finding the traitor before they strike again." The conversation turned to matters of security and investigation. Elspeth half listened, her attention on Rosalind, who had begun to fuss. She needed feeding, and soon. Elspeth shifted uncomfortably, wondering how to excuse herself without causing offense. Cillian noticed. "You need to tend to her." "Yes, Your Majesty. The nursery adjoins your rooms. Everything you need should be there. We'll continue this later." Elspeth rose, grateful for the dismissal, but before she could leave, Father Aldrich stood as well. "If I might have a word, Your Majesty? About the mark?" Cillian nodded, and the priest turned to Elspeth. "I've been researching the royal protection marks. They're rare, but not unheard of in our history. Always they appear when the realm is in great danger. When the moon goddess intervenes directly to preserve the bloodline." He paused. "There's more, though. The mark you bear is only half-formed." Elspeth looked down at her wrist. The silver crescent and sword gleamed as always. "What do you mean?" "A complete protection mark includes a second element. A binding, linking the protector not just to the child, but to the realm itself. It should appear within a fortnight of the first mark. When it does," he hesitated, "when it does, you will no longer be simply Elspeth of no pack. You will be recognized by every shifter in the realm as Luna, whether or not the formal ceremonies have been performed. The weight of his words settled over the table. Elspeth felt dizzy, and it had nothing to do with hunger. I see, she managed. Thank you for the warning. She fled before anyone could say more, hurrying back through the corridors with Rosalind crying against her chest. A Luna. The moon goddess wanted her to be Luna to the Alpha King, to rule beside the most powerful shifter in the realm. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was, apparently, inevitable. The nursery was warm and well stocked, with everything needed to care for an infant. Elspeth fed Rosalind, changed her, sang softly until the baby's eyes grew heavy. Only when the princess was asleep in her cradle did Elspeth allow herself to sink into a chair, her head in her hands. She needed answers. She needed to understand why this was happening to her, why the moon goddess had chosen an outcast Omega for such a task, and she needed to learn more about the mark itself and what it meant. The castle had a library, the maid had mentioned. Perhaps there would be answers there. Elspeth was making her way down a side corridor, Rosalind sleeping against her chest, when she heard raised voices ahead. She slowed, recognizing Cillian's deep rumble and another voice she didn't know. Cannot be serious about keeping that woman here. She's a nobody, a rogue with no credentials, no family, nothing to recommend her except a mark that could easily be a forgery. Enough, Cillian's voice cut through the protest. The mark is genuine. The priestess confirmed it, and more importantly, my daughter confirmed it. Rosalind will not accept anyone else's care. Then we find a way to break the bond. There must be magic that can break a bond placed by the moon goddess herself? Are you mad? A pause. Then, more quietly, what if she's a plant? What if whoever took Rosalind arranged this whole thing, sent her here to get close to you, to the court? I've considered that. Cillian sounded tired. But to what end? If they wanted to kill Rosalind, they could have done so in the mountains. If they wanted to infiltrate the castle, there are easier ways. No, this feels like something else. Like fate. You don't believe in fate. I didn't. I'm beginning to reconsider. Footsteps approached, and Elspeth quickly ducked into a side chamber, her heart pounding. She waited until the voices faded before emerging. Shaken. They still suspected her. Of course they did. She was a stranger who had appeared from nowhere bearing the king's daughter. Trust would have to be earned, if it could be earned at all. She found the library on the 3rd floor of the East Tower, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls. An elderly scholar looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression skeptical. Can I help you? I'm looking for information about royal protection marks. Their history, their meaning. The scholar's eyebrows rose. That's a rather specific topic. Might I ask why? Elspeth pulled back her sleeve, showing the mark. The scholar's eyes went wide. Moon's mercy. You're the one they're talking about. The Omega who brought back the princess. I am. And I need to understand what's happening to me. The scholar studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 3rd shelf. East wall. Look for a red leather volume titled Royal Bonds and Divine Intervention. It's old, but it's the most complete record we have. Elspeth found the book and settled into a corner chair, Rosalind still sleeping against her. The text was dense, written in an archaic style that made her head ache, but she persevered. What she learned made her blood run cold. Protection marks appeared in times of great crisis, yes, but they also had a darker purpose. They bound the protector to the protected so completely that if the child died, the protector would die as well. Their lives were linked, their fates intertwined, and more, the mark would grow stronger over time, becoming more demanding, more absolute. Eventually, she would be unable to think of anything but protecting Rosalind. Her own needs, her own desires, would fade away until she was little more than a guard dog, bound by magic to a single purpose. Unless the second mark appeared. The binding to the realm, Father Aldrich had called it. That mark would balance the first, would give her back her sense of self while still maintaining the protection. But it would also make her Luna in truth, would bind her to Cillian as completely as she was bound to his daughter. Elspeth closed the book, her hands shaking. This was the choice the moon goddess had given her. lose herself slowly to the protection mark, or accept a destiny she had never wanted as Luna to a king who barely knew her. Some choice. A bell tolled somewhere in the castle, marking the noon hour. Rosalind stirred and woke, and Elspeth held her close, breathing in the baby's sweet scent. "What have you gotten me into, little one?" she whispered. Outside the library windows, storm clouds were gathering. Chapter 5. Blood and Silver. Elspeth spent the following days learning the rhythms of castle life. She rose with the dawn, tended to Rosalind's needs, and tried to make herself useful in ways that would not draw unwanted attention. The servants were wary of her at first, but when they saw how naturally she cared for the princess, how she never asked for special treatment despite wearing dead queen's gowns, they began to warm to her presence. Cillian she saw only at meals, and even then he was distant, his mind clearly occupied with matters of state and the ongoing investigation into who had tried to kill his daughter. They spoke little beyond necessities. The mark on her wrist continued to pulse with its steady warmth, a constant reminder of the bond that linked her to Rosalind. But the second mark, the one that would make her Luna, had not appeared. On the 5th day, Cillian summoned her to his private study. The room was smaller than she expected, lined with books and maps, dominated by a heavy oak desk covered in documents. Cillian stood at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He did not turn when she entered. "You've been searching the library," he said. It was not a question. Elspeth felt her stomach tighten. "Yes, Your Majesty. I wanted to understand the mark, what it means. And what did you learn? That I'm bound to your daughter until one of us dies. That the mark will consume me unless—" she trailed off. "Unless the second mark appears." Cillian turned then, his gray-blue eyes studying her. "Making you Luna whether either of us desires it or not." "I didn't ask for this," Elspeth said quietly. "I know you didn't choose me. I'm just a rogue Omega who happened to find your daughter in the snow." "Are you?" Cillian crossed to his desk, picking up a sheaf of parchments. "I've been conducting my own research. About you, about where you came from. Your pack rejected you as sterile, but that's clearly no longer true. You shifted, partially at least, when the renegades attacked you in the forest. My scouts found the evidence." Elspeth's breath caught. She had hoped that incident had gone unnoticed. "I had never shifted before," she said. "Not once in 24 years. But when those wolves threatened Rosalind, something inside me woke up. The protection mark can awaken dormant abilities," Cillian said. "But it shouldn't create something from nothing, which led me to investigate your bloodline more thoroughly." He held up one of the documents. "Your mother's name was Catherine. She came from the Western Territories, from a family that kept largely to themselves. Your grandmother was named Serafina. I never knew my grandmother. She died before I was born." "Yes, she did. In childbirth, actually, delivering your mother. But before that, Serafina had another name, Serafina of House Silverblood." The name meant nothing to Elspeth for a moment. Then memory stirred, fragments of old stories heard around pack fires. House Silverblood, the Silver lineage, the ancient royal family that had been wiped out 3 generations ago in a massacre, their bloodline extinguished, their power scattered. "That's impossible," Elspeth whispered. "Is it? The timing fits. Serafina would have been a young woman when the massacre occurred, young enough to escape, to hide, to change her name and disappear into obscurity. She married a common pack member, had a daughter, died young. Your mother inherited nothing but the dormant blood, passed it to you." Cillian set the documents down. "You're not just any Omega, Elspeth. You're the last living descendant of House Silverblood, a princess of the old blood." Elspeth sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "But I can't be. I'm nobody. I was cast out, rejected, because your pack sensed something in you that didn't fit their understanding of hierarchy. Silver wolves don't follow the usual rules. They exist outside the pack structure, answer only to the moon goddess herself." Cillian's expression softened slightly. "The mark chose you because you were always meant for this. Your blood recognized Rosalind's, knew her for the true heir, and called to the moon goddess for protection. The renegades in the forest, Elspeth said slowly. They called me Silver. They recognized what your own pack could not. Elspeth looked down at her wrist, at the mark that had changed her life. What does this mean? It means the prophecy was true. There's an old text, forbidden, kept in the vault below the castle. It speaks of a time when the realm would face its greatest danger, when a traitor would rise from within, and only the union of two royal bloodlines could save the kingdom. My line and the Silver line, joined through bonds of protection and destiny. Cillian moved closer. The moon goddess has been planning this for generations, Elspeth. We are not accidents. We are instruments of her will. Before Elspeth could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Shouting, running feet, the clash of steel. Cillian's hand went to his sword as the door burst open. Lord Brennan stood there, blood streaming from a cut on his temple, his armor dented. Your Majesty, we're under attack. Renegades, dozens of them, breached the outer wall. They're fighting their way toward the royal wing. Cillian was moving before Brennan finished speaking. Get the princess to the safe room. Now. Elspeth clutched Rosalind tighter, the baby waking with a cry at the sudden noise. Where? The nursery. There's a hidden door behind the wardrobe. Take her there, and don't come out until I come for you personally. Cillian's eyes met hers. Can you fight? I don't know. I've never. Your instincts will guide you if it comes to that. But your first duty is to protect Rosalind. Everything else is secondary. He was gone then, sword drawn, running toward the sounds of battle. Brennan gestured urgently. This way. Hurry. Elspeth ran, following the Lord Commander through corridors that suddenly seemed like a maze. Behind them, the sounds of fighting grew louder. Screams, snarls, the meaty thud of bodies hitting stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and Rosalind wailed in terror. They reached the nursery just as a group of 3 renegades rounded the corner behind them. Wolves in half-shifted form, their faces elongated, fangs bared, eyes glowing with bloodlust. Brennan pushed Elspeth toward the wardrobe. Go. I'll hold them. You can't fight 3 alone. Go! Elspeth yanked open the wardrobe, found the hidden latch Cillian had described. A section of the back panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage lit by a single torch. She ducked inside just as Brennan engaged the first attacker. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She moved as quickly as she dared, one hand supporting Rosalind, the other trailing along the damp stone wall for balance. Behind her, the sounds of combat echoed, then cut off abruptly. Either Brennan had won, or he was dead. The passage ended in a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square, furnished with a cot, a barrel of water, and shelves stocked with preserved food. A safe room, meant to withstand a siege. Elspeth set Rosalind down on the cot, her hands shaking. The mark on her wrist was burning now, not with pain, but with urgency. Warning. Danger close. Footsteps in the passage. Heavy. Uneven. Not the measured tread of a guard or lord. Elspeth grabbed the torch from its bracket, the only weapon available, and placed herself between the entrance and the cot where Rosalind lay. A figure emerged from the passage. Not one of the renegades, but Osmond, his fine robes torn, blood on his hands. His eyes found her, and something cold and calculating flickered in their depths. Thank the moon, he said, breathing hard. I was looking for you. The castle is breached. We must get the princess to safety. But his gaze kept sliding to Rosalind, and the mark on Elspeth's wrist flared hot in warning. How did you know about this passage? Elspeth asked, not lowering the torch. I am the king's advisor. I know all the castle's secrets. Osmond stepped fully into the room. Come, child. We haven't much time. The king told me not to leave until he came for me personally. The king may be dead for all we know. If the renegades take this room, they'll kill you both. Osmond extended his hand. Trust me. But the mark was screaming now, silver light pulsing from her wrist, and Elspeth remembered what Cillian had said. Your first duty is to protect Rosalind. Everything else is secondary. No, she said. Osmond's expression shifted, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal something hard and merciless beneath. I was hoping you would be sensible. Unfortunately, I can't allow you to interfere." He moved faster than she expected, lunging for Rosalind. Elspeth swung the torch, catching him across the shoulder. He snarled, his form rippling, beginning to shift, and Elspeth felt her own wolf surge forward in response. Not the partial transformation from before, but something deeper, more complete. Power flooded through her, silver and ancient, drowning out thought and fear. Her bones reshaped, her skin erupted in fur that gleamed like moonlight on snow. For the first time in her life, Elspeth shifted fully. And the wolf that emerged was not brown or gray or black like common shifters. She was silver from nose to tail, eyes burning gold, larger than any normal wolf had a right to be. Osmond froze, his own transformation halting mid-shift. Impossible. The silver line is dead, Elspeth's wolf snarled, and the sound echoed with ancient authority. She placed herself between Osmond and the cot, every muscle coiled to spring. The advisor stared at her for a long moment, calculation warring with fury in his eyes. Then he backed away, shifting fully human again. "This changes things," he said softly, "but not the outcome. You'll learn that soon." He turned and disappeared back into the passage, moving with unnatural speed. Elspeth held her shifted form for several minutes longer, listening for any sign of pursuit. When none came, she let the transformation ebb, returning to her human shape with a gasp. Every muscle ached, and she felt drained in a way she had never experienced. But Rosalind was safe. That was all that mattered. She gathered the baby close and sank onto the cot, her silver-furred wolf retreating into her skin, but not sleeping. Not anymore. Above them, the battle raged on. Chapter 6. The Traitor. Unmasked. Elspeth waited in the safe room for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Every sound made her jump, every creak of stone or distant shout. Rosalind had finally cried herself into exhausted sleep, her small body warm against Elspeth's chest. The mark on her wrist had cooled from its earlier burning urgency, but it remained warm, pulsing gently, still connected, still protective. And now, after her transformation, Elspeth could feel something more through it, a thread of awareness that led not just to Rosalind, but outward, toward something, or someone else, toward Cillian, she realized. The second mark had not appeared visibly on her skin, but something had changed when she shifted into her silver wolf form. The bond was deepening, whether she willed it or not. Footsteps in the passage made her tense. She had no weapon now, having dropped the torch during her transformation, but she moved to place herself between the entrance and the cot where Rosalind slept. "Elspeth?" A voice, female and frightened. "Are you in there?" A woman stumbled into the safe room, her fine dress torn and smudged with soot. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair falling loose from its braids and eyes wide with terror. Elspeth recognized her from meals in the Great Hall. Lady Bethany, one of Rosalind's nursemaids. Lady Bethany. Elspeth did not move from her protective stance. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, for the princess." Bethany's gaze found Rosalind on the cot, and relief flooded her features. "Thank the moon she's safe." "I was so afraid." She broke off, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs. Elspeth's instincts warred with caution. The woman seemed genuinely distressed, but after Osmond's betrayal, she trusted no one. "How did you know about this passage?" "I didn't. I followed you, saw where you disappeared." The wardrobe was still open. Bethany lowered her hands, revealing tear-stained cheeks. "I need to tell you something. About the attack. About who's behind it." "I know who's behind it. Osmond showed himself. Osmond is part of it, yes, but he's not working alone. And there's something you need to understand about why." Bethany moved to the barrel of water, her hands shaking as she poured herself a cup. "I've been keeping secrets. Terrible secrets. Because he threatened my family." "Osmond threatened you?" 2 months ago, he came to me privately, said he knew things about my husband's dealings, things that could have him executed for treason. He demanded I help him, or he would see my husband hanged and my daughter taken as ward of the crown. Bethany's voice broke. "I have a little girl. She's only 3 years old. I couldn't let her lose her father. Lose everything. Elspeth felt a chill run through her. What did he make you do? Gather information. About the king's routine. About when Rosalind would be moved. About which guards could be bribed. I thought he was planning some political maneuver. A way to gain leverage over the king. I didn't know. She looked at Rosalind. Fresh tears spilling. I didn't know he meant to kill her. Not until it was too late. Where is your daughter now? That's what I came to tell you. 2 days ago, Osmond's men took her. Said they were moving her somewhere safe during the investigation. But I haven't been allowed to see her. I think he has her hidden somewhere in the castle. Somewhere the king's men haven't searched. Elspeth's mind raced. A hostage would explain why Bethany had cooperated, and why she was coming forward now, when cooperation had clearly failed to protect her child. Why should I believe you? Because I know where Osmond's real chambers are. The ones he doesn't want anyone to find. Bethany met her eyes. He has a room in the old dungeons, below the castle proper. That's where he keeps his records, his plans. And I think that's where he's holding my daughter. Before Elspeth could respond, the sound of fighting in the passage grew suddenly louder. Metal on metal, snarls and shouts. Then, Cillian's voice, commanding and furious, echoed through the stone. Find them. Search every corner. Here, Elspeth called. We're here. Cillian appeared in the entrance, his sword bloody, his armor dented. Lord Brennan was behind him, wounded but alive. The king's eyes found Elspeth first, then Rosalind, and something in his expression cracked. Relief, fierce and undeniable. You're safe. Osmond was here, Elspeth said quickly. He tried to take Rosalind. He's the traitor, Your Majesty. He organized everything. Cillian's jaw went rigid. Where is he now? He fled when I shifted. When he saw... She hesitated, then pushed back her sleeve. The mark on her wrist was glowing brighter than before, the silver light pulsing in time with her heartbeat. And there, just above it, a second mark was beginning to form. Not complete yet, but visible. A circle of thorns surrounding a crown. The mark of the realm. The mark of a Luna. Cillian stared at it, then at her face. You transformed fully. Yes. My wolf is silver, like the old bloodline. Then the prophecy is complete. He looked at Brennan. Find Osmond. Search the entire castle. I want him alive. Your Majesty. Bethany spoke up, her voice trembling. I know where he might be, but first, please. He has my daughter. A little girl, only 3. He's been using her to force my cooperation. I'll tell you everything, help you find him. But please, save my child first. Cillian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Show us. They made their way through the castle, a grim procession. Cillian led, sword still drawn, with Brennan and 4 guards flanking them. Bethany guided them down, past the main dungeons where common prisoners were held, to a staircase so old and worn that Elspeth wondered if anyone had used it in decades. The air grew cold and damp, heavy with the smell of stone and age. Bethany stopped before a door that looked like all the others lining the corridor, unremarkable and apparently unused. Here, this is where I saw him go late at night when he thought no one was watching. Brennan tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back, and 2 guards moved forward with a battering ram. 3 strikes, and the door splintered inward. The room beyond was larger than expected, and fitted out as a study. A desk dominated one wall, covered in documents and maps. Shelves held books that looked ancient and forbidden. And in the corner, behind a curtain, was a small pallet where a child lay sleeping. Bethany rushed forward with a cry, gathering the little girl into her arms. The child woke, confused and frightened, but unhurt. Cillian moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the documents. His expression grew darker with each page he read. He's been planning this for 30 years, he said quietly. Since before I was born, since before my father took the throne. He held up a journal, its pages yellow with age. Osmond orchestrated the massacre of House Silverblood. He was a young commander then, ambitious and ruthless. He convinced my grandfather that the Silver Line posed a threat, that their power rivaled our own. And when the order came down to eliminate them, he carried it out personally. Elspeth felt cold spread through her chest. Why? because he wanted to control who sat the throne. He thought with the silver line gone, he could manipulate events, place puppets in power, rule from the shadows. Cillian's hands tightened on the journal. But the prophecy said the two bloodlines must unite to save the realm. By destroying one, he thought he was securing his own power. Instead, he set in motion the very thing he feared. He created the need for someone like me, Elspeth said slowly. Someone with silver blood, who could bond with your heir. Yes. And now that you've appeared, now that the marks have formed, he has no choice but to try to kill you both before the prophecy can be fulfilled. Cillian looked at Brennan. Triple the guard on the royal wing. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization, and find Osmond. I don't care if you have to tear the castle apart stone by stone, Your Majesty. Bethany had settled her daughter against her shoulder, but her face was pale with guilt. I helped him. I provided information that led to the attack. I should be executed. You were coerced through threats to your child, Cillian said. And you've come forward now, when it mattered most. You'll be confined to your quarters during the investigation, but I will not punish a mother for protecting her daughter. Relief and shame warred on Bethany's face. Guards escorted her and the child away, and Elspeth found herself alone with Cillian and Brennan in Osmond's hidden study. He'll try again, Elspeth said. As long as he's free, he'll keep trying. I know. Cillian's eyes met hers, and she saw the wolf looking back. Not human reason, but primal determination. Which is why we're going to find him tonight. And when we do, I will end this. Permanently. He said something before he ran. Elspeth remembered. He said this changed things, but not the outcome. Like he had another plan already in motion. Cillian and Brennan exchanged dark glances. The old dungeons have more than one secret, Brennan said. There are passages that lead outside the castle walls. If he's fled, then he'll gather more forces and return. Cillian sheathed his sword with a decisive snap. We end this now. Brennan, take the search outside. I'll check the lower passages. Alone, Your Majesty? I'm never alone. Cillian looked at Elspeth. Can you fight? Truly fight if it comes to it? Elspeth thought of her silver wolf, of the power that had surged through her when Osmond threatened Rosalind. Yes, I think I can. Then come with me. Rosalind will be safe with Brennan's men guarding her, but I need you with me. The mark connects us now, and where I go, you should follow. It was not quite a command, not quite a request. It was simple truth, spoken by a man who was beginning to understand that their fates were bound together far more thoroughly than either had anticipated. Elspeth looked down at Rosalind, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them. The first mark pulsed warm on her wrist, and above it, the second mark continued to form, thorn by thorn. Let's end this, she said. Chapter 7. Silver and Stone. The lower passages beneath the castle were older than the fortress above, carved from living rock by hands long dead. Torchlight flickered against damp walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with intent. Elspeth followed Cillian through corridors that twisted and branched, a maze designed to confuse invaders or trap them in the dark. These tunnels were built during the First Wars, Cillian said, his voice low, when the realm was still young and the royal houses fought for dominance. My ancestors used them to move troops unseen, to launch surprise attacks, to escape when the castle fell under siege. How do you know which way to go? I was taught the paths as a boy. Every heir to the throne learns them. It was one of the few things my father insisted upon. Something bitter entered his voice. He said a king must always have an escape route, must always be ready to abandon his people to save himself. Elspeth caught the edge in his words. You disagreed. A king who runs is no king at all. Cillian paused at an intersection, listening. The mark on Elspeth's wrist pulsed warm, responding to his nearness. She could feel his wolf now, prowling just beneath his skin, alert and hunting. Her own wolf stirred in answer, silver and restless. They moved deeper, the air growing colder. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that echoed off stone. Then Elspeth heard it. Voices, faint but distinct, coming from ahead. Cillian raised a hand, signaling silence, They crept forward, keeping to the shadows, until they reached a natural cavern that opened off the main passage. A dozen men stood within, renegades by the look of them, armed and armored. And at their center stood Osmond, no longer wearing the robes of a royal advisor, but leather and mail suited for battle. "Fool to think he can stop what's already in motion," Osmond was saying. "The castle is in chaos. Half the guard is searching for us, while the other half protects that cursed child. By dawn, we'll have reinforcements from the northern packs. They've been waiting for this moment, the signal that the Silver Line has returned." "And if the girl completes her transformation?" one of the renegades asked. "If she becomes full Luna? Then we kill her before that happens. The marks are still forming. She's vulnerable." Osmond's expression hardened. "I spent 30 years ensuring the silver bloodline was extinct. I will not let one surviving whelp undo everything I've built." Elspeth felt rage kindle in her chest, hot and fierce. This man had murdered her family, destroyed her bloodline, all for power he had never earned and had no right to claim. Cillian's hand found her wrist, his fingers closing over the marks. "Wait," he breathed. "We need to know their full plan." But Osmond was turning, his nostrils flaring. "We're not alone. Someone's listening." The renegades drew weapons, moving with the coordinated grace of trained soldiers. Cillian swore and stepped into the cavern, sword already in hand. "Your treason ends tonight, Osmond." The advisor smiled, cold and merciless. "Does it? I think not. You came alone, Your Majesty. Foolish, but I suppose that's what happens when a king is distracted by a pretty face and an inconvenient prophecy." "He's not alone," Elspeth said, stepping out beside Cillian. The mark on her wrist blazed silver, and she felt her wolf surge forward, demanding release. Osmond's eyes fixed on her, calculation flickering in their depths. The silver whelp. "How convenient. I was going to hunt you down, but you've saved me the trouble." "You talk too much," Cillian said, and lunged. The cavern erupted into violence. Cillian moved with brutal efficiency, his sword a blur of steel as he engaged 3 renegades at once. But the others were converging on Elspeth, and Osmond was shifting, his form rippling as fur burst through skin. Elspeth let her wolf free. The transformation was faster this time, smoother, as though her body remembered the shape. Silver fur cascaded across her skin, her bones reshaping, her senses exploding into sharper focus. She met the first attacker head-on, her jaws closing on his arm, her weight driving him to the ground. Blood filled her mouth, hot and metallic. Another renegade lunged at her back. She twisted, claws raking across his chest, and he fell with a howl. Across the cavern, Cillian fought with terrifying grace, but he was outnumbered. One of the renegades landed a blow that sent him staggering, blood streaming from a gash across his ribs. Elspeth's wolf snarled, protective fury overwhelming conscious thought. She launched herself at Cillian's attacker, silver and fury, driving him away from her mate. Her mate. The thought settled into her mind with absolute certainty. Not just the king she was bound to by prophecy, but hers. Her wolf had claimed him, and would destroy anything that threatened him. Osmond's shifted form was massive. Brown fur shot through with gray, teeth like daggers. He circled her, looking for an opening. "You're young, untrained. The silver blood means nothing without the skill to use it." "Maybe," Elspeth growled, her voice halfway between human and wolf. "But I have something you don't, a reason to fight." She feinted left, then struck right, her claws finding the soft flesh beneath his jaw. Osmond jerked back, blood spattering stone, his eyes wide with shock. Elspeth pressed her advantage, driving him backward. Around them, the battle was turning. Cillian had cut down 2 more renegades, and the survivors were beginning to realize they were overmatched. Osmond shifted back to human form, breathing hard, blood streaming from the wounds on his throat. "This changes nothing. Even if you kill me, there are others. The conspiracy goes deeper than one advisor. Then we'll root them out," Cillian said, appearing at Elspeth's side. His sword was leveled at Osmond's chest. "One by one, until every traitor hangs. You can't win. The realm is fracturing. The packs no longer trust the crown. My death will only—" The confession died as Cillian's blade struck, driven by fury and justice in equal measure. Osmond fell, his expression frozen in surprise, and the remaining renegades broke, fleeing into the dark passages. Elspeth shifted back to human form, suddenly exhausted, and would have fallen if Cillian had not caught her. His arms were solid, warm despite the cold air, and she leaned into his strength. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her, checking for injuries. "No." Tired, but whole. She looked up at him, at the concern etched across his features. "You're wounded." "It's nothing. Brennan will have healers waiting above." But he did not let her go. "You saved my life. You saved mine first. In the safe room, when you came looking for us." Elspeth touched his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded jaw. "We're bound, Cillian. Not just by prophecy or marks, but by choice. I choose this. I choose you." Something cracked in his expression, the careful control he had maintained since they met fracturing to reveal the man beneath. "I didn't want this. Didn't want to be forced into another bond by divine mandate. But watching you fight, seeing your courage," he shook his head. "The moon goddess chose well. Better than I deserved. We both deserve happiness," Elspeth said softly, "even if we have to fight for it." Above them, in the castle proper, bells began to ring. Victory bells, announcing that the traitor had been found and defeated. Cillian helped Elspeth to her feet, and together they made their way back through the passages, following the path of torchlight that Brennan's men had lit. When they emerged into the great hall, the assembled court fell silent, staring at their blood-stained king and the silver-marked woman at his side. Brennan stepped forward, taking in their condition with a soldier's eye. "Osmond? Dead," Cillian confirmed. "Along with 6 of his conspirators. The rest fled. Find them. I want every traitor brought to justice." "Your Majesty." The priestess appeared, moving through the crowd with surprising speed for one so old. Her eyes found Elspeth's wrist, and a smile crossed her weathered face. "The second mark is complete. Look." Elspeth raised her arm. Where before only the first mark had fully shown, now both marks gleamed silver against her skin. The crescent moon and sword of protection, and above it, the crown wreathed in thorns. The mark of the realm. The mark of a Luna. The priestess turned to address the assembled court. "By the will of the moon goddess, the prophecy is fulfilled. 2 royal bloodlines, united to save the realm. I present to you Luna Elspeth of House Silverblood, protector of the heir and mate to the Alpha King." The court erupted into noise, some voices raised in celebration, others in protest. But Cillian raised his hand, and silence fell. "The moon goddess has spoken. The marks have formed. Elspeth of House Silverblood is my Luna, and any who challenge that fact, challenge me." His voice carried to every corner of the hall. "The coronation will take place at the next full moon. Until then, she is to be treated with all the respect due her station. This is not a request. It is a command." He turned to Elspeth, his expression softening. "Come. Rosalind will be frantic without you." They walked through the castle together, past guards who now bowed to both of them, past servants who curtsied and murmured, "Your Majesty" to Elspeth as naturally as they did to Cillian. In the nursery, Rosalind was indeed crying, her small face red with distress. But the moment Elspeth lifted her, the baby quieted, her tiny fist closing around Elspeth's finger. "She knows," Cillian said quietly. "She's always known. That you were meant to be her mother." Elspeth looked up at him, tears stinging her eyes. "I was cast out because I couldn't have children. And now I have a daughter without ever bearing one. The moon goddess has a strange sense of humor, or perfect timing." Cillian reached out, his hand cupping the back of Rosalind's head, so that for a moment they were all connected. Father, mother, child. A family forged not by blood, but by destiny. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking over the river, washing the world in shades of gold and rose. The battle was won, the traitor was dead, and the realm, fractured and uncertain, had a Luna again. Chapter 8. Crown of Silver and Stone. 6 moons had passed since the night Osmond fell. 6 moons of healing, rebuilding, and rooting out the last remnants of conspiracy from the kingdom. The remaining traitors had been found, tried, and executed. The pacts that had wavered in their loyalty had been brought back into the fold through a combination of diplomacy and strength. And throughout it all, Elspeth had stood at Cillian's side, learning what it meant to be Luna to a realm that had almost torn itself apart. The full moon rose over the castle, washing the ancient stones in silver light. Tonight was the coronation, the formal ceremony that would make official what the marks had already declared. Elspeth stood in the chambers that had once belonged to Cillian's first queen, staring at her reflection in a mirror that had seen generations of royal women prepare for their greatest moments. The dress she wore was silver silk, embroidered with threads of white gold that caught the candlelight. The gown had been made specifically for her, fitted to her body by the most skilled seamstresses in the realm. Around her throat hung a necklace of moonstones and diamonds, and in her hair, pins shaped like crescent moons held her dark curls in an elaborate arrangement. She looked every inch a queen, and yet, when she looked at her face, she still saw the rejected Omega who had lived alone in a mountain cabin, gathering herbs to survive. "You're thinking too much," a voice said from the doorway. Elspeth turned to find Cillian watching her, dressed in ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine. A crown of white gold sat on his dark hair, and the royal sword hung at his hip. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were warm, almost fond, in a way they never had been in those early days. "I'm remembering," she said, "how far I've come, how impossible this all seemed." "Is it still impossible?" He crossed the room to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. In the mirror, they looked like what they were. King and queen, bound by more than prophecy now. "No. It feels right. Strange, but right." She touched the marks on her wrist. Both glowed faintly in the moonlight. The crescent and sword of protection. The crown wreathed in thorns of Luna's bond. "Have you heard from Bethany?" "This morning. Her daughter is settling well in the new household I arranged for them. Bethany herself has asked to serve as Rosalind's nursemaid again, when we think it's safe. I'd like that. She made a mistake, but she came forward when it mattered." Elspeth met his eyes in the mirror. "Mercy matters, Cillian. As much as justice. I'm learning that. You've taught me much these past months." His hands tightened briefly on her shoulders. About leadership, about trust, about what it means to rule with heart, as well as strength. A knock at the door interrupted them. "Your Majesties, it's time." The great hall had been transformed. Torches burned in every sconce, and the ancient banners of House Silverblood hung alongside the crimson and silver of the current royal line. The hall was packed with nobles, pack leaders, common folk who had traveled from across the realm to witness this moment. At the far end, on the raised dais, 2 thrones waited. One had always been there, carved from oak and inlaid with silver. The other was new, fashioned in the same style, but wrought from ash and decorated with moonstones. The priestess stood between the thrones, her white robes seeming to glow in the torchlight. Lord Brennan was there as well, fully healed from his wounds, along with Father Aldrich and the other members of the Reformed Council, and in a cradle near the thrones, watched over by 2 guards, Rosalind slept peacefully. The child had grown in 6 moons. She was nearly a year old now, beginning to pull herself up on furniture and babble in sounds that might someday become words. Her blue eyes tracked movement with keen intelligence, and when Elspeth entered the hall, the baby immediately reached for her, knowing her mother had arrived. The assembled court rose as Elspeth and Cillian entered. They walked together down the long aisle between the rows of witnesses, their steps perfectly matched. When they reached the dais, Cillian ascended first, taking his place on the oak throne. Then he extended his hand to Elspeth, and she placed hers in his, allowing him to guide her to the ash throne beside him. The priestess raised her hands, calling for silence. "We gather tonight to witness the fulfillment of prophecy," she intoned, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. 30 years ago, House Silverblood was betrayed and destroyed. Its line was thought extinct, its power scattered. But the moon goddess sees all, knows all, plans all. She preserved one daughter of that house, hidden among common pack members, her royal blood dormant until the moment it was needed. The priestess turned to Elspeth. Elspeth of House Silverblood, last daughter of the Silver Line, you were chosen by the moon goddess herself to protect the heir to this realm. You bore the mark of protection without complaint, traveled dangerous roads without hesitation, and faced death itself to keep the princess safe. More than that, you have proven yourself wise in counsel, fierce in battle, and compassionate in judgment. You are worthy to stand as Luna, to rule beside the Alpha King, to guide this realm toward peace. She lifted a crown from the cushion held by Father Aldrich. It was delicate but strong, fashioned from silver so pale it was almost white, set with moonstones that seemed to hold their own inner light. By the authority vested in me by the moon goddess and the traditions of our people, I crown you Luna Elspeth, Queen of the Realm, Protector of the Air, and Mother to the nation. May your reign be long and your wisdom endure. The crown settled onto Elspeth's head, and the moment it touched her hair, the marks on her wrist flared bright. Silver light poured from them, cascading over her skin, her dress, spreading outward to fill the hall. The assembled court gasped as the light touched them, warm and welcoming, and undeniably divine. When the light faded, Elspeth could feel the change. She was connected now, not just to Rosalind and to Cillian, but to every shifter in the realm. She could sense their wolves, their allegiance, their hearts. The bond was not controlling or demanding. It was simply there, a web of connection that linked her to her people. The priestess turned to the assembly. Your Luna stands before you, marked and crowned. Do you accept her rule? As one, the court dropped to one knee. We accept, they said in unison, their voices echoing off stone. Cillian stood, offering his hand once more. Elspeth took it and rose, and together they faced their people, king and queen, Alpha and Luna, partners in a bond forged by prophecy, but strengthened by choice. The celebration lasted long into the night. There was feasting and music, dancing and stories told of the realm's deliverance from treason. Elspeth moved through the crowds, accepting congratulations, listening to petitions, learning the names and faces of those who would be her subjects. But her favorite moment came when she slipped away from the festivities to the nursery, where Rosalind had been taken to sleep. Cillian found her there, sitting in the rocking chair with the baby in her arms, singing softly. She'll be awake all night if you keep doing that, he said. But there was no censure in his voice. I know, but I wanted a moment with her, with both of you. Elspeth looked up at him, away from the crowds and the ceremony. Cillian knelt beside the chair, his hand covering hers where it rested on Rosalind's back. I never thanked you properly for everything you've given up. Your freedom, your solitude, your simple life in the mountains. I gave up nothing that matters, Elspeth said. I gained a daughter, a partner, a purpose. The cabin was lonely, Cillian. I didn't realize how lonely until I had this. We're going to have more, he said quietly. Children, I mean. If you're willing. Father Aldrich says the marks should have healed whatever prevented you from conceiving before. Your wolf is whole now, and strong. Elspeth felt warmth bloom in her chest. I'd like that. A sibling for Rosalind, maybe 2. Or 3, Cillian suggested, and she laughed softly. Let's start with 1 and see how we manage. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Rosalind sleep. Then Cillian spoke again, his voice thoughtful. I received word from Pat Grafin today. Their Alpha wishes to meet with you, to apologize formally for your exile. Elspeth considered this. 6 moons ago, the news would have brought anger, or hurt. Now she felt only a distant pity. What did you tell him? That the decision was yours. If you wish to see him, to accept his apology, I will arrange it. If you wish never to see him again, I will send him away. I'll see him, Elspeth decided. Not because I need his apology, but because he needs to give it, and because I want him to see what I've become. Not out of spite, but as proof that his judgment was wrong. That worth is not determined by pack status, or the ability to shift on command. Cillian smiled. That rare, genuine expression that transformed his severe features. Spoken like a true queen. Later, when Rosalind had been settled in her cradle, and the celebrations below had finally quieted, Elspeth and Cillian stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out over the river valley. Snow was beginning to fall, the first of the winter season, dusting the world in white. "Do you remember the night you found her?" Cillian asked, his arm around Elspeth's waist. "In the snow, beneath the oak tree? I remember thinking my life was over, that I would die in that storm, or be killed by whoever had left a royal baby to freeze." Elspeth leaned into his warmth. "I never imagined it was actually a beginning. The moon goddess works in mysterious ways." "She does." Elspeth touched her belly, where new life had just begun to form. She had not told Cillian yet. The pregnancy was barely 2 moons along, too early to be certain. But she knew. Her wolf knew, and she would tell him soon, when the time was right. For now, it was enough to stand here with him, watching snow fall on their kingdom, knowing that Rosalind slept safe in the nursery, and that the marks on her wrist no longer burned with urgency, but glowed with quiet contentment. She had been cast out as worthless. She had been chosen as essential. And in the end, both had been necessary to bring her here, to this moment, to this life she had never dared to dream of. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in silver and white, and somewhere in the mountains, in a cabin that had once been her only refuge, wildflowers would bloom again come spring. But Elspeth would not be there to see them. She had new gardens to tend now, a new home to protect, and a future bright with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The mark of the moon goddess gleamed on her wrist, a reminder of destiny fulfilled and promises kept. And high above, the full moon watched over the realm, its light blessing the Luna who had risen from nothing, to become everything her people needed. The end.